Hello, very good evening. In today's lecture, basically we will learn how you can use fragments in Android Studio. Now, fragments are similar to activities, but they are type of activity that you can embed or nest within your main activity. So if you have a main activity, if you create another activity, you have two different activities to switch. But what if you want to create a component that changes the layout within your own activity? For example, WhatsApp. If you use WhatsApp, you click on chats, the chat activity pops up. But if you click on status on the same window, the status panel comes up. Then you go into the calls come up. So basically, when you change the top three buttons, the fragments are basically changing. This activity remains same. Same goes with the Facebook. So within the Facebook, there are one main activity, and within one main activity, the fragments basically are changing. Same goes with Instagram. So the idea is that you have one main activity. Within that activity, you have sub fragments that keep on changing. Based on the fragments, you change the layout, structure, design of it. Same thing goes for the game development. When we develop game, we have small fragments that behave. So the remotes and the buttons and the values, each is a separate fragment that displays an independent information from the other. Okay, so how do we do that? In this tutorial, we will learn this very quickly. My name is Dr. Zeeshan. If you're here for the first time, please don't forget to visit my page and subscribe the channel. You will find that on my channel, there are more than 500 video lectures based on PHP, Mail scripting, Maya embedded language, 3D graphics, from developing HTML, CSS, JavaScript to working on Android, Photoshop, multimedia technology, and so on and so forth. So these tutorials will be very helpful and very productive for you. So don't forget to subscribe, hit that bell icon, and receive notifications regularly. Let's begin. So now I have a very simple app created for me. This is a default blank app. I've not done anything else. Within this particular app, what we do is I delete the text field. I have a constraint layout. So let me just go inside the code, and I think you can come back here and delete this constraint layout, and let me just use something called linear layout. Okay, so if I press enter, spacebar, I have a linear layout available for me. Okay, so now what this basically means that my linear layout has been created. So if I go back here, you see that I have a linear layout available. Now by default, this is horizontal. What I want it to be vertical. So what I do, I come here, I go inside orientation, orientation, and make it vertical, and then go back here, and now it's vertical. So vertical means it's now in this order. Okay, I hope you understand. Okay, so now what do? We need some buttons inside this buttons, images, text fields, whatever you basically want to create, whatever you want here as a component. So in my case, let me just create a button here. So if I drag and drop one button here, then drag and drop another button here, so I have two buttons, but I don't want that. I want two buttons to be on the side by side. So this is a little trick that we do. So if I delete these buttons and delete this button, so instead of inside the linear view, I go inside another layout, and this time I create a horizontal layout. So as its first component, basically I'm adding a horizontal layout. Then we go inside the buttons and add a button inside this linear layout, one. And then if I add the second button, it will automatically be placed as a two component. So if I zoom into it, you could see better. Okay, so here we are. So now we get two buttons. So if I add a third button again inside the linear layout, I have a third button available. Then below this, I want another component available, which can be a single row component, which can be a dual array component. I can add another layout in below this linear layout to organize the structure completely differently. So for example, I will add another linear layout inside this horizontal layout. Okay, so once this linear layout is available, inside this linear layout, I will go inside the containers, and I will add something called fragment container. Okay, and this fragment container has been added. You must create one or more fragments in the node. So as soon as I add the fragment, it says you must create one or more fragments in the node. So I said, okay, no problem, let's just create the fragment. Now idea is, if I click on button 1, the first window fragment comes, the button 2, the second fragments, the button 3, third fragments. So basically I will be needing 3 different fragments. As soon as I switch, each fragment will change within the same activity. So we come back into our Java app folder, right click here, new, and you go inside the fragments. So fragments already there. All you need to do is you just need to click on fragments. So by default, let me just create a blank fragment. Okay, and let's just name this blank fragment as, for example, your news. Okay, news fragment. So if I click on finish, my news fragment is created. Now fragments are just like your activities. However, they are more lightweight. They can be nested. You can have many fragments within one single activity. That's why it allows us to work more efficiently. So as soon as the fragments are created, you will notice that the two files have been created. One, fragment news.xml, second, fragment news fragment.java. On your main panel, you will find activity and fragment news. Two different fragments layouts and 2 different Java files. So this was for my first one. Fragment news we created, we got the layout. So you would notice everything is same. We have a frame layout inside it. Okay, we'll talk about that in later classes. We have a component available for the text. We have a news fragment.java. So basically what happens is that when you create a fragment, it's similar to activity. So it's again creating 2 files, one for Java, one for layout. You have a layout based on XML, you have a Java file for the backend coding. So you get the same thing, but you can design your custom fragments now. What exactly you want in that particular fragment to be. Okay, so in this case, so we have just created a simple fragment. So now what we need to do is, let me go inside this particular text. I don't want to do anything fancy, so I will just select this text and I will say, okay, let's just make it news fragment. Okay, so the news fragment has been created. Let me just scroll down and I will just make it size, for example, 34 sp, make it center and make it bold. If I scroll down, I have something called background color. We can change the background color of this image as news fragment. Okay, so I have this news fragments now created for me. You can drag this because the frame layout, so this is basically based on the entire frame. You can come here and use the padding to control how much space occurs between it. So if I scroll down, where's padding? Here it is. Okay, so padding top can be, for example, 20 dp. So if I press enter, so you now note that there's a space from the top. Okay, so that's what I need to do. So I have a simple fragment. Now you can design anything you want here, any components, any segments, any structure that you want. You can design a complete form here. This is a complete blank layout that you want to do. So you can have buttons here, you can have images here, you can have controls, radio buttons, everything you want within this particular framework. You can change the layouts, whatever you want to do. It just is to take it as an activity. So we have one fragment available. Now if I go back inside main activity, I have one button. So let me rename this as news. So if I click on news, I should get something called news. Okay, news. And let me just rename the button as button NEWS news. Oops. Okay, yes, refactor it. So I've changed the ID of the button. I've changed the text of the button. First thing, I select the second button. Okay, I go inside the ID. I say BTN. This can be, for example, sports. Okay, yes, refactor it, press enter. And the text can be again sports. So it's like I'm building a news kind of a thing. So this is general news, this is sports. So I have this button available. Third button, this I will make it as button, for example, SCIEN science, right? And yes, refactor it, come here, SCIENCE science. Okay, so I created 3 buttons. The idea is very simple. When I click on a button, the content of the same layout activity change. Then I click on the second button, the content layout change. Then I click on the third button, the content layout change. Got it? Perfect. How do we do that? We create something called fragments. How do we create fragments? We right click, we create a new fragment, which behaves like an activity, but it can be nested. It can be a child of an activity. So within an activity, we can have 1, 2, 3 more fragments. We can have other fragments and we can switch between multiple fragments within one main activity. I hope it makes things easy. So once we are done with this thing, now what we need to do is we need to do same thing. So file, new and fragment, and we create a new blank fragment. We name it not blank, but SPORTS, sports fragment. Click on finish. And my sports fragment has been created for me. Okay, then again app, right click, new, again fragment, blank fragment. This time I create something called SCIENCE science fragment. Click on finish. So science fragment has been created. So basically we created 3 different fragments. Okay, one for news, one for science, one for sport, but we have one main activity. So the idea is that within same activity we swap between these 3 different fragments. Got it? I hope it becomes self-explanatory. So once I go inside my news fragment, where's my news fragment? This is my news fragment. I have a basic component available. So I right click this text field, copy it. Let me go inside the science fragment, select this text field, delete it, and inside let me paste it. So I have a news fragment pasted. So instead of doing it again, let me just copy paste, go home. This is supposed to be SCIENCE science fragment. So let me rename it. Let's just choose a different color. So this time this can be, for example, a light green in shade. That works for me. And then now let's just go inside the sports fragment. select the text field, delete it. Now this again many people have been asking. What I did just right now is I went inside the news fragment, I selected the text which I had already done some designing with it, and I want to use the same component. I don't want to do that same thing again. So we can copy paste the components. So I selected it, copied it, went inside the frames sports fragment and deleted the previous component, and now just paste it. So that component is again pasted. So you can copy paste components across different activities, different fragments. You take one code from online, you see a very good design, you can copy it and paste it. It works fine. Then you just customize it and change the name. So this can be my, for example, sports fragment, right? So now I'll just come here and delete. This will be my sports fragment. Okay, and let me just change the color from green to maybe yellowish. That should do the trick. So now we have 3 different fragments. Let me close the Java file so we can see the GUI. Okay, so sports, science and news. So we have 3 different fragments available. Now the idea is all these 3 to appear inside here. So we again go back inside main activity, inside the containers, fragment container view. Select this. So you can use a frame layout as well. You can use a different layouts, but sometimes fragment container just works appropriately. So I select it and I make sure I drop it inside this linear fragment. Once I do that, it will ask me, okay, this is a fragment container, it needs to have a fragment. Which fragment do you want to hold? Now remember, when the first time we dropped, it gave us an error that you at least need 1 fragment. Now it is giving us an option that you have created 3 fragments. Which is your default fragment, the first fragment that will be displayed? So I said my news fragment, like your home page. So I click OK and my home page has been set. Okay, so once this is set, what we need to now do is just check few things. So for example, if I come here linear, I should be able to see some output here, but I'm not getting any component here. So what I do, I go inside the main linear layout and make sure I have something called content wrap set, so that the first linear layout is set to this particular component. Then if I come inside the linear match parent, then I select the second one. If I select this also to match content, and I think match parent, match parent, and then if I select the fragment also, I make sure it's match parent. Nope, I'm not getting it. Here we go. Let me just bring it down so that the fragment container actually you can see it as a complete blueprint here. So once you select the fragment, you should be able to see these blue dots, means that it is completely wrapped together. Now if I execute it, let's just see and check that whether you are getting the fragment correctly or not. Okay, so as soon as the app starts, now you can see that basically we have news, sports and science button, and in the middle we have something called news as a fragment. Okay, so by default on activity there's nothing, but inside the linear layout we have added a fragment container, and then we told this fragment container that the news fragment is your default. So it's by default showing me the news container. Now what we basically want to do is that as soon as I click on news button, news fragment comes. If I click on sports button, the sports fragment comes. If I click on science button, the science fragments comes. So let's do that. Okay, so I go back inside my code and now I select this button here. Now this is the tricky part. Typically we use something called onclicklistener, but we will do that and along with that we need to do something called fragment transaction. I will show you in a moment what we basically mean. So if I select this button and I go inside the main activity.java file, and this is my main activity.java file. Now what I need to do is I need to do same thing. So I will do button that we have been doing previously, right? So we'll do the same thing. For example, button and EWS news is equals to find view by ID r.id. There is a button called news. Find me that button from the XML file, import it and save it in a Java class file. Once this is done, button news dot set onclicklistener. We apply this particular method. Then we write new view. The view onclicklistener event message pops up. Just press enter. The code is written for you automatically for onclick event listener. Event listener means when you click on this button, something should happen. That's called an event listener. So you need to set that. This is the code that we do. Just 2 lines we wrote very quickly. The code is available. Now the tricky part comes into the play. Now basically what we need something called a fragment manager that would manage between multiple different fragments. Okay, so switching between fragments is not as simple as using intent for your activities. Switching between fragments requires you to use something called fragment manager. So if you head over to your developer.android.com/guide, and inside here under fragments you have something called fragment manager. You can go through all of this text. Basically idea is very simple. You have a fragment and you need a manager to manage when each of these fragments are needed and required to be displayed. This is considered as a transaction. So there is a fragment manager that performs a transaction of displaying multiple fragments. Okay, and in order to use that on your developer.guide, basically there's lots of information available, but we basically come inside fragment transaction. Inside the Java code there is the code for us. So this is the code that we need to transact from one fragment to another when a button is particularly clicked. Let me just copy this and bring inside my Android, and then I will explain each of this code one by one what does exactly mean. So we have button. Inside the button news is done. Inside this button news I pasted the code. So what I need, first of all, fragment manager that manages between multiple fragments, because remember there can be hundreds of fragments that you want to manage. So you need a proper manager to understand that within one activity you are managing multiple different fragments. If you get an error, alter enter. Cool tip, right? As soon as you press enter, the error is removed because it automatically resolved and it saw that it needed a fragment manager class to be imported. Issue resolved. Okay, make sure there's nothing underlined. These two are red. I will talk about this in a moment. So what we did here is we created a Java class called fragment manager, and we told it get me a supported fragment manager. So we executed a default method that will give me a supported fragment manager. So whoever is available manager within our Android application, it will retrieve that, assign it to this particular variable. Then we will use this variable to manage between fragments. Got it? So once we do that, now I have my manager. Who is available is assigned here. Whoever is available, whatever is the manager, get me that supported manager, assign it to this variable. Once this is done, now let's debug this manager. So we have a fragment manager, the variable we just created, dot begin transaction. So basically we are not telling that, okay, fragment manager, you have been created. Your task is to transact from one fragment to another. It's called transaction, like your bank transactions. So we say begin transaction dot replace. So this is similar to this thing. So if I come back here, fragment manager dot begin transaction. Okay, so as soon as I write this fragment manager dot begin transaction, my transaction would begin. But what do we want to do within this transaction? We want to say replace the current fragment with something new, with another fragment. So that's why we use a replace method. Within the replace method, we want to say, okay, replace what? So we say r.id dot get me the fragment container view. So fragment container view 5. This is my container view. If you want to verify it, let's just go inside our XML. We select the fragment container view. Note fragment container view 5. This is the ID name. So whatever is your ID name, basically that's what you need here. Fragment container view 5, your ID name, comma. So we found the container. Now replace this container with a new fragment. Okay, replace whatever is inside this container with a new fragment. So we said my fragment name is, for example, news fragment dot class, and then we just pass the null argument, and then that's done. Okay, so fragment manager dot begin transaction. Once the transaction begins, dot replace the current fragment container with this new class file, new fragment, then dot set reorder allowed to true. So reorder has been allowed to true. Then dot add to backstack, and we just give it an argument as, for example, any name of that particular backstate if you have. For now I just leave it to yes, and then finally dot commit. Okay, so as you can see, this is a long CO double. Commit means now perform this particular transaction. So because this is a long line, instead of writing this entire line, we have broken down into this particular code. Same thing, just the dot has came on the new point. So if I come here, fragment container, replace this line, then dot, then I've just added the dot, and it just works, right? So if you come here and dot, so this is what basically means that fragment manager begin transaction, replace the current fragment ID with this new fragment class with a null argument. Reordering is allowed, add to back state means when you click on the back button on your Android phone, it works and the commit is done. So we have a code available. That's it. So if I delete this, or if I delete this previous copy pasted code, my function should work fine. Done. Here we go. Perfectly done for us. So now whenever I click on this button, this code will execute. Same thing now for the second button. So I copy this entire code, bring back here. Let me give an argument. Code for sports button to SWIC switch fragments. Paste. All I'm going to change is the button name. So button sports. Find me a button sports, and this button news becomes button sports. On-click listener, everything is same except the fragment view same, except this news fragments sports fragment. That's it. So we change the button. Now this time find me a sports button, assign it to a sports button variable. On this button set a on-click event listener. The event listener code is there. Same fragment manager gets supported fragment manager. We might not able to use it if we use it outside this particular button class. Then we say fragment manager begin transaction replace. So if I am going to use this again and again, let me just cut this, bring it here, Control X, and save it outside of this particular code. Okay. Fragment manager to manage code. Done. So once we have done the sports button, I will copy the same code again, come back here, paste it, this time for SCIEN science fragment. Let's rename the button to SCI. Find BTN, not sports but SCI science button. Let me just rename this button to SCI for science. Use this button for on-click listener. Fragment manager again is available. Use this fragment manager, find this fragment container and replace it, this time with SCI science fragment. Okay, that's it. So the same code, copy paste and repeat, same code, copy paste repeat. We just change the variable names. We just change the names of button. So in this button sports is used, and in this class button news is used, in this button science is used. Here science fragment.class file, sports fragment.class file, news fragment.class file. The code is self-explanatory. We took the code from Google's developer. It basically means replace it, allow reordering, allow go back from the default back button, perform the activity. Once this is done, let's execute. Okay, and see how our things are going. Okay, so my app is now up and running. So basically what I have this default activity available, which has a news thing. So if I click on news, I get a news, but if I click on sports, see this, I get a sports fragment. If I click on science fragment. If I go back on news fragments. So just like WhatsApp or Facebook or Instagram, now you are within the same activity. If you click on news, you get a complete different layout. If you click on sports, you can have a complete different layout. If you click on science, you get a complete different layout. You can organize this layout as you like. Obviously, you can scroll them. You can have different components and structurally design anything you want. Okay, so this is basically what Fragments allows us to do, that within single activity we are able to have different segments. Remember, I had this wrapped to a complete frame. You can have one little fragment here, you can have a second fragment here, you can have multiple fragments within the same activity layout. Okay, so I hope you understand this particular phenomena. To switch between activities, you do need something called Fragment Manager. Fragment Manager basically allows you to manage and control the activities of your fragments, right? And the code we use from your Google developer code. So if you are into Google developer, developer.android.google.com, you go inside the guide and you will be able to use this fragment code here. And let me just copy it and notepad. I will try to drop this link. Oops, sorry. I will try to drop this link in your description as well. You can find this code here. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. This is Dr. Zeeshan.